Have you ever found yourself speaking, pouring your heart out, only to realize the person in front of you isn't really there? Maybe their eyes are on you, their head nodding, but their mind somewhere else entirely. And maybe you've done it too. It happens to all of us. We live in a world of constant noise, conversations, notifications, opinions, endless commentary. So much talking, so little listening. And yet, beneath all that noise, every human being carries a silent wish to be heard, to be understood, to be seen without judgment. It's one of the deepest cravings of the human heart. But somewhere along the way, we forgot how to truly listen, not just hearing words, not waiting for our turn to speak, not formulating replies while someone else is still talking. I mean listening in a way that makes the speaker feel lighter, safer, less alone, listening that heals. Buddhism calls this deep listening, the kind of listening that doesn't just involve your ears but your whole being. It's not a technique. It's not a skill to master. It's a practice, a way of being fully present without needing to fix, to judge, or to interrupt. A way of offering the other person space to be exactly as they are. And the beautiful thing, when you listen this way, you heal yourself too. There's an ancient story from the Buddhist tradition. A disciple once asked the Buddha, "Master, what is the quickest way to ease the suffering of others?" The Buddha smiled gently and said, "Listen. Not preach, not advise, not tell them what to do, just listen. Because when we truly listen to another person's pain without our own agenda clouding the space, something extraordinary happens. Their suffering begins to soften. And in that shared silence, we glimpse the interconnectedness of all beings. The modern world, for all its advancements, is starved for this kind of presence. We hunger for authenticity, for depth. We want to be known beyond our curated social media profiles and clever sound bites. We crave the kind of connection that only arises when one person dares to fully show up for another. And yet, how often do we offer that gift? How often do we receive it? Most of us live in constant reaction mode. Someone speaks, and our minds instantly leap to comparisons, judgments, solutions. We listen to reply, not to understand. But if you've ever been in the presence of someone who truly listens, with their heart open, their mind still, their eyes kind, you know how rare and precious that is. It's not just a courtesy, it's medicine. This is why in Buddhist practice, listening is considered a sacred act. Not something passive, but an active expression of compassion. It requires humility, patience, and above all, love. The great Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh once said, "Deep listening is the kind of listening that can help relieve the suffering of the other person." He spoke often about how our inability to listen is the root of much of our personal and collective pain. Families break apart because no one listens. Communities fracture. Nations go to war. But when one person chooses to pause, to be fully present, to listen not just with their ears but with their soul, the world around them begins to heal, little by little. And it's not some lofty, unattainable ideal. It's something you and I can practice right now. Today, we don't need a monastery. We don't need a degree in psychology. We just need to remember. Because deep down, we all know how to do this. We were born with this capacity. It's in our nature. The question is, are we willing to slow down enough to offer it? To ourselves, to our loved ones, to the strangers we pass by, to a world aching for connection. This journey we're about to take together isn't about mastering a new technique. It's about remembering an ancient wisdom we've long forgotten. A wisdom that says, to listen is to love. And as we travel deeper into this exploration, you might discover that by offering deep listening to others, you learn to truly listen to yourself as well. Because often, the voice we most ignore is our own. And somewhere in that still, quiet space of deep listening, we may stumble upon the peace we've been searching for all along. So take a breath. Let's begin. There's a silence, a kind of quiet that isn't empty but alive. It's the sound of being fully here, with no need to fix, correct, or fill the space with words. This is the space where deep listening begins. In the Buddhist tradition, listening is not just a tool for communication. It's a path, a form of meditation in itself, a sacred offering we make to another being. But what exactly is deep listening? And how is it different from the ordinary way we listen in daily life? Most of the time, when someone talks to us, we listen through a filter, the filter of our own experiences, opinions, fears, and judgments. Before they even finish a sentence, we're already crafting a reply, silently agreeing or disagreeing, comparing their story to our own. That's not really listening. That's waiting to talk. In Buddhism, deep listening, or what Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh often called compassionate listening, means being fully present with another person's words, feelings, and unspoken emotions. It's offering your undivided attention without the need to interrupt, analyze, or control the outcome. You become like a still, clear lake. Whatever is said, whatever emotions arise, you receive them without ripples of judgment. It sounds simple, but it's one of the hardest things we can do, because to truly listen to another person, you have to set yourself aside, your opinions, your need to be right, your urge to solve their problems. In that moment, their suffering, their joy, their confusion, it matters more than your clever advice or comforting words. You offer them what Buddhist teachings call K-A-L-Y Amakron, letter 1E47 Amatata, spiritual friendship. Not by speaking, but by listening with your entire being. In the Sutra on the Full Awareness of Breathing, the Buddha describes the importance of being mindful of not just our breath, but our contact with others, the way words, sounds, and emotions touch us. And when we're deeply attentive, we notice something. Most people aren't asking for solutions. They're asking to be understood. And it's through this act of understanding that transformation happens. Thich Nhat Hanh once shared a story of a young man filled with anger toward his father. Years of unspoken resentment weighed on their relationship. When the young man sought Thay's guidance, the Zen master didn't offer advice. He simply invited him to practice deep listening, to sit with his father, not to argue, not to blame, but to truly hear him. At first, it was excruciating. The father spoke harshly, reliving old hurts. The son's heart ached. But he kept listening, softly breathing, letting the words rise and fall like waves in an ocean. And somewhere in that space, something softened. The father's voice cracked, tears surfaced. A lifetime of pain unfolded in words the son had never truly heard. It didn't fix everything, but it opened a door. That is the power of deep listening. In Buddhist psychology, there's a term called samatha, calming the mind. Deep listening is a kind of samatha for both the speaker and the listener. As the speaker unburdens their heart, their suffering begins to settle. And as the listener stays fully present, their own restless thoughts quiet down. It's a shared peace. The Buddha also taught about loving kindness, metta, and unconditional friendliness toward all beings. Deep listening is one of the highest expressions of metta, because in those precious moments you're saying, I see you, I accept you, you are safe here. No advice, no solutions, just presence. And what makes this so healing is that it requires nothing but your willingness to be there. No expertise, no perfect words, just an open heart. When you listen deeply, you hear more than what is spoken. You hear the tremble beneath the anger, the loneliness behind the bragging, the unspoken sorrow in a laugh. You realize every human being carries invisible wounds. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is let them unburden those wounds in your presence. The world today is loud. Everyone wants to be heard, but few remember how to listen. Buddhism invites us to reclaim this forgotten art, to treat listening as a daily spiritual practice, a way of reducing the suffering in our families, our communities, and ourselves. Because when you practice deep listening for others, you begin to notice the silent voices inside your own mind too, the neglected parts of yourself asking to be heard. Your fears, your doubts, your longings. And as you hold space for them without judgment, you start to heal in ways you didn't know you needed. This is the beauty of Buddhist wisdom. It teaches us that to care for others is to care for ourselves, and to care for ourselves is to become a vessel of compassion for others. As we continue this journey, let's begin to explore not just why deep listening matters, but how we can actually practice it in our everyday lives. Because it's one thing to understand the concept. It's another to sit down with someone in pain, set aside our judgments, and be fully present. And that's where the real transformation begins. Sometimes the hardest thing about listening is not the other person's words, it's our own mind. We sit across from someone, nodding as they speak, but inside there's a storm of thoughts, a restless commentary narrating every word they say. That's not true. I've heard this before. Wait till I tell them what I think. We think we're listening, but what we're really doing is waiting. In Buddhism, these invisible obstacles are called mental formations, habits of thought and feeling that cloud our awareness. And when it comes to listening, they act like walls between us and the person speaking. If we don't recognize them, we can't truly hear. So what are these barriers? Let's name them, because when you name a shadow, it begins to lose its power. First, the barrier of judgment. This is the voice in your head labeling everything you hear: good, bad, right, wrong. It interrupts before the other person has finished their thought. It decides what you'll believe, what you'll dismiss, and what you'll argue against. And once judgment steps in, true listening steps out. The Buddha taught that one of the roots of suffering is attachment to views. We cling so tightly to what we believe is true that we close ourselves off to what might actually be true for someone else. Then comes the barrier of impatience. Modern life has trained us to rush. Conversations are no exception. We get restless when someone speaks slowly. We want them to get to the point. And while they search for their words, our mind is already ahead of them, finishing their sentences or planning our response. In this hurry, we miss the most precious parts, the pauses, the hesitations, the things left unsaid. Because in those small silences, the heart often speaks loudest. Next is the barrier of self-centeredness. This is when everything someone says gets related back to us. They mention a struggle and we instantly think of our own. They share a joy and we compare it to ours. We turn their story into our story. But deep listening in the Buddhist sense requires us to step aside, to make space for another's experience without crowding it with our own. Another common barrier is the need to fix, especially with people we love. When they express pain or frustration, our instinct is to jump in. Have you tried this? Don't worry, it'll be fine. Let me tell you what you should do. We mean well, but solutions aren't always what the heart needs. As Thich Nhat Hanh said, sometimes the most compassionate response is to just listen, to hold someone's suffering without trying to change it. And then there's the barrier of emotional reactivity. Some words sting, old wounds get touched, and before we know it, we're no longer listening, we're defending, arguing, or shutting down. In Buddhist practice, this is where mindfulness of feeling becomes essential. Noticing, anger is here, or sadness is rising. Not pushing it away, not acting on it, just witnessing it like clouds passing through a sky that doesn't cling to any one shape. Lastly, the barrier of distraction. The most ordinary, yet the most constant. Our devices buzz. Our to-do lists tug at our attention. Even while listening, we're half scrolling, half watching, half anywhere but here. But Buddhism teaches that presence is the most precious offering we can give. Because presence means, right now you matter. Right now I'm here with you. When we're aware of these barriers, we can begin to lower them. And it's not about perfection. Even monks in monasteries wrestle with wandering thoughts and restless hearts. But the difference is they notice. They return to the breath. They bring their attention back again and again. That's the practice. The Buddha often spoke about the importance of right effort, not straining to be flawless, but gently, persistently cultivating what is wholesome and releasing what is unwholesome. In listening, this means noticing when a judgment arises and letting it go, recognizing impatience and softening into patience, feeling the need to fix and choosing instead to simply be. Little by little, the walls thin. The distance closes, and we start to hear not just words but hearts, because the truth is people rarely remember the advice we give, but they remember how it felt to be truly heard. And in a world starved for that kind of presence, your willingness to listen deeply becomes a radical act of kindness. So as we move forward, let's gently turn our attention toward how to cultivate this kind of listening, not as a one-time event, but as a daily spiritual practice. Because listening isn't something we do occasionally, it's a way of being. And when we learn to live like that, the people around us change. And so do we. There's a kind of listening that can heal, a way of hearing not just the words but the sorrow behind them, the hope beneath them, the longing no one else seems to notice. The Buddha called this compassionate listening. It's not a technique. It's not something you perform, it's a quality of the heart, and it begins with presence. To listen with compassion, you must first be here, not half scattered in your worries, not half distracted by your phone, but fully, quietly here. Because a heart in pain can sense when yours is absent. Sometimes we underestimate what it means to simply be present for someone. We think, I have nothing to offer. I don't know what to say. But often, the greatest gift you can give is your undivided presence, a steady, gentle awareness that says without words, I see you, I'm here with you, you don't have to carry this alone. Compassionate listening is not about agreeing. It's not about fixing. It's about creating a safe, silent space where a person can empty their heart. Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Zen master, would tell his students, you listen in order to relieve the suffering of another person. That's the whole purpose. Not to analyze, not to judge, not to offer clever advice, just to relieve suffering by being the one person who truly listens. And here's the beautiful truth. When you listen in this way, healing happens on both sides. The person speaking begins to soften. Their pain lightens as it's spoken aloud and received without resistance. And you, the listener, begin to feel your own heart grow wider. A subtle warmth fills the space between you. A quiet dignity rises from within. It's as if two hearts, for a moment, remember what it means to be human. But to listen with compassion, you must be aware of your own feelings too. You cannot offer calm presence if you're lost in anger or tension or fear. This is why mindfulness is the foundation. As you sit with someone's story, whether it's grief, frustration, or joy, stay close to your own breath. Notice what arises in you. Is there impatience, a need to respond, a tightening in the chest? Acknowledge it, don't fight it, and gently return your attention to the one speaking. This act of returning over and over is the core of compassionate listening. And sometimes it's not easy. Some people will pour out anger, bitterness, stories that sting old wounds inside you. And in those moments, your task is not to argue or shrink or run, but to hold steady, to remember that beneath anger is usually pain, and beneath pain is a wish to be seen, to be understood. One of the Buddha's most powerful teachings on compassion is this: see the suffering beneath the behavior. When someone lashes out, ask yourself, what is this person carrying? What hurt lives behind these words? And even if you can't know for sure, that simple act of wondering transforms you. You begin to listen less with your opinions and more with your heart. It softens your gaze. It makes room for complexity. It reminds you that every human you meet is fighting a battle you cannot see. And here's something most people don't realize. Compassionate listening isn't just for others. You can listen this way to yourself. In meditation, when a painful thought arises or an old memory surfaces, you can meet it with the same spacious, non-judging attention. You can ask yourself, Dear One, what are you trying to tell me? This inner listening is where compassion is born, because a person who has learned to listen gently to their own suffering will naturally be able to hold the suffering of others. And so, in Buddhist tradition, the art of compassionate listening is not a skill to master, but a way to live. It turns ordinary conversations into sacred encounters. It turns conflict into understanding. It turns strangers into companions. And perhaps in a world so full of noise, it's the medicine we all need. So the next time someone speaks to you, whether it's a friend in crisis, a child's small confession, or a stranger's passing complaint, pause. Take a breath, let your heart be quiet, and offer them the rarest thing in the world, your full, compassionate attention. You might be surprised at how something so simple can mean so much. There's something quietly miraculous about listening, not the kind we usually practice, half attentive, already crafting our reply, but the kind where you let go of yourself for a moment and fully open to another person's world. At first, it seems like a gift you're offering to them, but over time, you realize it's also a gift to yourself, because every act of true listening changes you. In Buddhism, this is one of the great hidden teachings. That deep listening is not only for understanding others, it is a doorway into understanding yourself. When you truly listen, you come face to face with your own habits, your impatience, your assumptions, your quiet judgments you didn't even realize were there. It's a mirror, and what you see in it isn't always comfortable. You notice how quickly your mind wants to interrupt, how often it clings to its own certainty, how easily it begins rehearsing advice before the other person has finished speaking. And in those moments, if you have the courage to pause and watch, you start to glimpse something deeper. You see how your mind is always trying to be the center of the story. It wants to be right. It wants to be clever. It wants to be important. And so, it struggles to truly hear anything that challenges its preferred version of reality. But when you catch yourself in this, not with shame, but with curiosity, something beautiful begins to unfold. You realize that the simple act of quieting your thoughts and making space for another's experience is itself a form of inner training. Every time you choose to listen without defending, without fixing, without turning the spotlight back to yourself, you soften the ego's grip. You become less reactive, less consumed by the need to be right, more open to complexity, to ambiguity, to the rich, contradictory mess of being human. And this is how deep listening becomes a path of self-transformation. It teaches patience. It sharpens awareness. It dissolves the boundaries between you and the other. In Buddhist practice, we often speak of the illusion of separation, how we imagine ourselves as isolated islands, disconnected from one another. But when you truly listen to someone's sorrow, or their quiet joy, or the secret they've carried for years, something inside you shifts. You realize, this too I have felt. This too lives in me. And in that moment, the line between speaker and listener fades. There's only shared humanity. A Zen saying puts it this way: when you listen deeply, you hear not just one voice, but 10,000 voices echoing through it. Meaning that within every story, every complaint, every confession, lies the echo of countless others. And through those echoes, you begin to recognize your own forgotten wounds, your old joys, your hidden fears. It's like hearing a distant bell and realizing it's ringing inside you too. This is why deep listening is so transformative. It reveals the interconnectedness we spend so much of our lives ignoring. And here's the part no one tells you. When you practice this kind of listening with others, you naturally start practicing it with yourself. You begin to notice the quiet voice beneath your anger, the longing behind your ambition, the grief beneath your numbness. You learn to listen to your own heart, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a dear friend carrying burdens you never fully acknowledged. And in doing so, you start to heal. You soften old rigidities. You forgive parts of yourself you once resented. You become less afraid of silence, less addicted to noise, because you've seen again and again that beneath the noise there's something sacred, a spacious awareness, a vast stillness, a simple, undeniable tenderness. And it changes how you move through the world. You become less eager to speak and more curious to hear, less fixated on being understood and more devoted to understanding, not out of obligation, not to appear wise, but because you've tasted what it's like to truly connect and you don't want to live any other way. So the next time you find yourself in conversation, Whether with a friend, a stranger, or your own restless mind, try this. Breathe, let go of your need to be clever, notice what arises in you, and then listen, not for what you expect, not for what you fear, but for what is truly there. You might discover that the person you're listening to isn't as separate from you as you once believed. And in that discovery, you'll find a kind of quiet freedom, the kind that only comes when you finally stop trying to control the conversation and simply, humbly listen. Have you ever noticed how the world feels louder these days? Not just in the literal sense, though the endless scroll of breaking news and viral opinions certainly adds to the static, but in a deeper, more unsettling way. It's a kind of spiritual noise, a relentless clamor of unmet needs, unspoken grief, and unheard voices. We're a world aching to be listened to. And yet, no one seems to be truly hearing. We talk over each other. We debate without pausing to understand. We fill silences with empty noise because we're terrified of what we might feel if things got quiet. But here's a truth as old as the mountains. What the world needs most right now is not more clever words, but deeper, quieter listeners. And this is where Buddhism offers something timeless, a practice not just for personal peace, but for collective healing. Because when you listen deeply to one person, when you make space for their pain without fixing, for their joy without envy, for their confusion without judgment, you create a small sanctuary, a quiet place where another being can, for a moment, lay down the weight they've been carrying. And it matters more than we realize. A Vietnamese Zen master once said, "You cannot love someone if you cannot listen to them." And by love, he didn't mean romance or affection. He meant that profound human recognition. I see you, I hear you, your suffering is real to me. In a world obsessed with proving and persuading, this kind of listening is radical. It interrupts cycles of hurt. It disarms conflict before it takes root. It reminds people of their own humanity when they've started to forget. Think about it, how many of the world's cruelties begin because someone wasn't heard? A child's pain ignored, a community's voice silenced, a nation's wounds dismissed. And how much could soften if, instead of rushing to correct or condemn, we simply sat down and truly listened? It might seem small, but healing always starts small. A conversation, a hand on a shoulder, a long, quiet moment where someone finally feels safe enough to say what they've been holding back for years. Buddhist traditions speak of listening with the ear of the heart, not just processing words, but sensing the life beneath them, the fear behind the anger, the longing inside the complaint, the tender hope beneath the cynicism. When you listen this way, you start to realize something quietly astonishing. Every person you meet is carrying a private world of sorrow and beauty you'll never fully grasp. And once you sense that, cruelty becomes harder. Judgment loses its sharp edge. You begin to move through the world with more softness, not because you're weak, but because you understand. And here's where it becomes even more powerful. This isn't just a kindness for others. It's medicine for your own restless spirit. Because when you practice deep listening with others, you're also training yourself to listen to life. You notice the wind against your skin, the ancient ache in your chest you've been ignoring, the way the light falls on your kitchen table in the late afternoon. You begin to hear the world not as a threat or a problem to be solved, but as an unfolding conversation, one you've been too distracted to notice. And in that conversation, you rediscover a kind of belonging, a sense that you are not separate from the world's sorrows or its joys, that you are a thread in the vast, trembling fabric of life. And this, too, is healing. It heals the illusion of isolation. It heals the wound of disconnection. It reminds you that even in your quietest grief, you are held in a vast, unseen web of listening. Perhaps this is what the old teachers meant when they spoke of listening to the cries of the world, not as a burden, but as a sacred invitation, an invitation to show up, to bear witness, to offer the kind of presence that asks for nothing in return, but transforms everything it touches. So the next time you feel powerless in the face of the world's noise, the endless arguments, the heartbreak, the tragedies scrolling past your feed, remember this: your listening matters, not the performance of it, not the appearance of being open-minded, but the quiet, humble act of giving someone or something your full, unguarded attention. It might not solve everything, but it will change something. It might be a stranger's day, a friend's grief, your own heart. And from that small change, something else might shift, and then another. Because this is how healing begins, not in grand gestures, but in countless tender acts of listening. And when enough of those acts gather, they shape a different world, a world where it's a little easier to breathe, a little safer to speak, a little less lonely to exist. And isn't that worth listening for? In a world bursting with noise, urgency, and distraction, the simple act of listening may seem almost revolutionary. But as we've journeyed through this exploration together, we begin to see that listening is not just a passive habit. It is a profound practice, a call to awaken our hearts, to soften our minds, and to meet one another with genuine presence. Buddhism teaches us that every sound, every word, every silence carries the potential to transform. To listen deeply is to step into that potential, to honor the sacredness of each moment shared, to recognize the invisible threads that connect us all. It is an invitation, not just to others, but to ourselves, to slow down, to open up, and to truly be here. Because listening is more than hearing. It is a practice of compassion, of understanding, of healing. So, as you go forward from here, I invite you to carry this practice in your daily life. Listen without judgment. Listen without planning your response. Listen with the ear of your heart. Notice how the world changes when you do. Notice how your own heart softens. Notice the ripple effect of kindness, understanding, and connection. And if this message resonates with you, if this journey into the art of listening has touched something inside, I warmly invite you to join the conversation on this channel. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and let us build a community where deep listening is not just an ideal, but a lived reality, because the world needs listeners now more than ever. And together, through the simple power of listening, we can begin to heal ourselves and the world around us. Thank you for listening. May your ears be open, your heart be wide, and your presence be a gift to all you meet.